Hi there. I'm Steve Weberg with the library staff, and I am your official introducer, although I suspect you would probably prefer to have Leslie. She's much more lively. Thank you guys, everyone here, for joining us tonight. I'll spare you some lame joke about please don't bull rush the stage and slap either me or the speaker tonight, and I'll just say that I'm fairly confident that we can keep order in an auditorium with a fairly significant military presence. We're back with our good friends from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College for the third installment of our Hollywood versus History series, which has just been a terrific series to this point and will continue. We're examining, of course, what filmmakers have gotten right in military movies, from ordnance and tactics to just the depiction of the period, and to where they took maybe some artistic license, where they maybe strayed from the facts. We've already covered 19th century British colonialism in The Man Who Would Be King, and Napoleon's undoing in Waterloo. And by the way, if you missed those events in the past couple of weeks, you can watch them and watch videos of really just about all of our library signature speaking events on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/KC Library. So I would invite you to go there. Coming up in our Hollywood versus History series in May and June, we'll take a look at the Crusades in the movie Kingdom to Heaven. We'll take a look at the 1960s Cold War, hilariously, in Dr. Strangelove, and at the Civil War's first black all-black volunteer company in the film Glory. And you can go to our website, kclibrary.org, for details on all of those. And there's one other program not in this series that I wanted to point out to you before we start, and it also involves the Command and General Staff College, and it's in 3.5 weeks. David Cotter, who is an authority in genocide studies at the Command and General Staff College, will look back at what's called the forgotten genocide. It was the massacre or relocation of some 1.5 million Armenians under the cover of World War I in what's now Turkey. The United States, facing various political pressures, had held off on officially recognizing that incident as genocide just until President Biden did that last April. And unfortunately, David will be speaking on a subject that's taken on new resonance as we follow current events in Ukraine. Now, his presentation is April 21st. It's at the Central Library, and again, there are details on that on the library website. Tonight, we're back to film study, and we're privileged to have yet another distinguished military historian, John Curatola, and he'll lead us through a look at the 1990 film Memphis Belle. It's about the 25th and final combat mission of the famed B17 Flying Fortress and its crew during World War II. We know the characters in the film are composites, but John will walk through how it otherwise holds up to actual World War II history. John's a professor in the School of Advanced Military Studies at the Command and General Staff College. He served almost 22 years in the Marines, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Holds a doctorate in military history from the University of Kansas. Don't know if he's celebrating a Final Four appearance right now. I didn't think to ask him. He says he is. This is the 4th time he's spoken at the library. Last was in February 2020, which was one of our last in-person events before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he talked at the Central Library then about the U.S. Marines landing on Iwo Jima. I want again to express our gratitude to the late Jerry Rosenblum, in whose memory we're presenting this program and this series. He, with a generous gift from his estate, has made this series possible, and we are indebted to him and to his family. We'll have time, if you're familiar with our process, for a few programs at the end. We'll set some microphones here in the front, and we'll not just invite, we insist on you using them. Please no hollering from the audience, and I'm going to ask you to enforce that, John. And that's because we are recording this, again, for archiving as a video, and if you're hollering from the audience, we're not going to hear what you're saying. We need you at those microphones. Now, I really would ask you to please join me in welcoming John Curatola back to the library. John, it's just great to have you here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm sure most of you just picked up on the fact that he said I was a Marine officer for 22 years, and here I am talking about the Air Force. So I am a Marine officer who works for the Army, who studies the Air Force. Yes, that is correct, okay? The truth of the matter is I'm really just a frustrated B-17 pilot born about 30 years too late. I've had a passion for military aviation since I was a child, specifically with the Combined Bomber Offensive, which we'll talk about today, as my godfather was a B-17 pilot during the war, flying with the 15th Air Force. And he regaled me with many of his stories, which helped stoke my interest in this topic we're going to talk about today. Again, we're looking at this idea of the Memphis Belle and the myths that have been kind of generated around her and her crew. And I'll take those on today. But in starting off, obviously I have a picture of the actual crew and then the movie crew, and then the nose art Memphis Belle on there. And you're probably wondering, well, who the heck is the Memphis Belle anyway? It's a lady named Margaret Polk, who was the pilot, Captain Robert Morgan, his girlfriend at the time. And before the crew actually flew overseas, the good captain was taken with this caption of this woman on a phone in a Vanity Fair magazine, and he actually called or wrote the artist up, and he said, "Can I put that on the nose of my airplane?" And the artist said, "Sure, go right ahead." And in many instances in the Second World War, the local squadron artist, somebody who had some artistic skills, painted it on the nose. And that's kind of the background of the nose art itself. Comes from the fact that it indeed was the pilot's girlfriend. And the crew agreed to do that, which is always important. What we're going to do today, this is basically the agenda I'm going to talk about. I'll start with the history first, give you a little background on the Combined Bomber Offensive, strategic bombing theory, Operation Point Blank, and then we'll shift gears to the movie itself. I'll point out here on slide number 2 the difference between history and Hollywood. Here is the actual nose art, and there is the Hollywood stylized nose art. You can see it's a little bit fancier. It's not. It's a little more colorful than what you would see, in the real nose art. I would say that if you're ever interested, nose art is a fascinating study of men in combat, especially in the Second World War, of course, but also in Korea and Vietnam. It's a fascinating study because it expresses so much about the men, their motivations, where they came from, and it really provides some insight into the individuals themselves. So I highly recommend you take an exit down that, and there's some beautiful nose art. Beautiful, beautiful nose art that is out there. All right, let's start off with the doctrinal piece. I'm going to bore you first and lay out the foundations of why are we doing this combined bomber offensive? What's behind this thing? Well, as a result of the First World War, where you have men sitting in trenches, dying and getting stabbed, and barbed wire, and all the horrors that we know of trench warfare, this elegant idea, and that's my term for it, of maybe we can stop a war by flying over enemy defenses, attacking where they produce the sinews of war. Maybe that will preclude the war from becoming something larger, something like the First World War, which we want to avoid. So if we go ahead and attack the factories, the population centers, maybe we can preclude this from becoming the mess that the First World War was. Now, some of the ideas behind this differ. If you're in the European side of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, you target people. If you kill a lot of people, that will create such a motivation to not have war that people will force their governments to have some kind of a ceasefire. The Americans have a fundamentally different approach. Yes, we want to bomb enemy cities, but we don't kill people per se. We go after infrastructure, power plants, factories, water plants, all those things that people need to sustain their lives and to sustain a war effort. And we're going to do this through this idea of precision bombing. That's how we're going to frame it. Again, we don't kill people per se, but we kill things. The truth of the matter is, by the time the British conduct their bombing offensives and the Americans conduct our bombing offensives in the war, there is very little difference between the applications in either Air Force. Okay. But these are the basic tenets. The fact that an enemy economy has areas that you can target, they can be identified, you can hit them with precision, that bombers will always get through. And remember, most of this stuff is conjecture. We saw what happened in the First World War with air powers, and it's safe to say that in the First World War, the war shaped air power more than air power shaped the war. If you get where I'm going with this. But as a result of the interwar years, airplanes are flying higher, faster, further. You think about Amelia Earhart and Wiley Post and Charles Lindbergh. Aviation grows by leaps and bounds in terms of capability. And so if you take these growths in aviation technology, these things kind of bubble to the top as feasible ideas regarding reducing an enemy's ability to conduct warfare. Okay? And the fact that we can hit these targets accurately, you can bomb enough times to collapse an enemy economy, and the enemy will not have any effective countermeasures. Now again, keep in mind, in the First World War, you didn't have really enemy heavy bombers. You had the Zeppelin raids, and it created some local morale problems for the British, but it really wasn't widespread. And airplanes were relatively limited, wood, fabric structures, but now you have aircraft that are made out of metal. They have 400, 500, up to 1,800 horsepower over the decades leading up to the Second World War, and so they're more capable airframes. Oh, and by the way, not a lot of aircraft got shot down in the First World War by ground fire. Okay? And so there's no way you can shoot an airplane down if it's moving higher or faster. Well, of course, in World War I, you didn't have radar. Okay, and you didn't have high-range artillery like 88-millimeter cannons that can shoot up to 20,000 feet. So there's a technological piece to this that the Air Force focuses on that they think they're going to be more effective than they really are. Okay. So in the interwar years, the Army Air Corps starts developing this idea of precision bombing. And again, we don't kill humans, we only attack infrastructure. And they do a lot of tests over the clear skies of Muroc, California, and the sunny skies over Texas. And you can see here for the numbers themselves on where they see their percentages going. The problem is, when you're over, anybody here's been to Germany, you know that probably 60% of the day it is overcast, cloud cover, okay? And these are all visual bombing methods that we're using this time, looking through a reticle in a bomb site to hit a factory. They will develop radar later on in the war, but it's not very accurate. And so when you start throwing on weather, when you start throwing on the fact that these men are in combat, you throw in that now the enemy is shooting at you, not only in terms of anti-aircraft fire, but also fighters are intercepting you. The dynamic changes significantly, because these are human beings in these aircraft, and they're going to respond as human beings. I know that sounds pretty big. Yeah, of course they are. But keep in mind, this is a sterile environment. They're not flying in combat when these methodologies are developed. And that's going to change the nature of the execution here. Okay? Now, I mentioned just before we started that there's two applications here. There's the British on the far side of the Atlantic, and then there's the way the Americans do it. As I told you before, we're going to fly in an ice formation. We're going to fly in the daytime, and we're going to do precision bombing on individual targets. The British, on the other hand, are going to do something different. They tried this kind of precision bombing early on in the war, and they realized this ain't going to work because we can't hit the targets. It's just not worth our effort. So we're going to fly at night. We're going to fly in what's called a bomber stream. What that means is instead of flying in a huge formation like the Americans will, they will take off at dusk, one at a time, flying at the same altitude, same heading, same azimuth in a straight line. And what will happen is an aircraft will mark the target with a flare, and then at night, as the British bombers come over Germany, they will drop their bombs onto the flare, where they see the flare, and basically hit the area of the flare, not necessarily a target itself. The problem with this is not very accurate. As a matter of fact, in 1941, the Royal Air Force does a study. It's called the Butt Report. That's what it's called. Leave it alone. It's called the Butt Report. Okay? And it says that most of the time, these guys aren't getting within 5 miles of the target. It's that bad. Okay? But there's no reason to stop. So, at any rate, that's what the British are doing. Now, in 1943, the Americans and the British meet in Casablanca. Churchill and FDR get together, and they're going to talk about the combined bomber offensive. And word gets back to the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps, a guy by the name of Hap Arnold, that the British are going to request the Americans follow their lead in the night bombing campaign. Now, Hap Arnold is bent on one thing, an independent U.S. Air Force. And he wants to see the Air Force make the biggest splash it possibly can in the Second World War. And strategic precision bombing is the way we're going to do it. Okay? When he finds out about Churchill pushing this idea forward, he calls up the commander of the 8th Air Force, a guy by the name of Ira Aker, and he goes, get down to Casablanca, go talk to Churchill, and tell him about American precision bombing doctrine and why we do this. And he gets his audience, and Churchill listens to the pitch, and he leans back in his chair, and he says, you haven't proven your point to me, but you've convinced me you should have the opportunity to prove your contention. As a result of that, you have what's called the Casablanca Directive, where it says each Air Corps or Air Force will conduct strategic bombing in accordance with its doctrine. So as a result, the Americans by day, the British by night, and this starts what you have called the round-the-clock bombing of German and the Axis states because of the Casablanca Directive. It's interesting, I actually read the letter where Hap Arnold wrote to Ira Aker, and he says, get down here and talk to Churchill and tell him that precision bombing is 10 times more effective than area bombing. I got to think, how does he know that it's 10 times more effective? He doesn't. He's making it up because there's no prior experience with this before. There's no precedent with this. So a lot of things the Air Corps is doing here, they're kind of making it up, okay? And as I said to you before, as the war goes on, this idea of precision, the definition of what a target is changes over time and also by Air Force. What the 8th Air Force considers a target is not what the 15th Air Force will consider a target, and vice versa. So in all honesty, we speak with forked tongue when it comes to precision bombing in the United States. Okay? And again, we believe our own press. No pun intended. I actually pulled that out of a magazine here in Collier's from 1942 before we get started. Now, how are we going to do this thing? How are we going to conduct this strategic bombing offensive? Largely through the B-17 Flying Fortress. It's what it's referred to, built by Boeing in Seattle. There's another plane called the B-24 that also flies, but in terms of Memphis Belle, we're talking about the B-17. Got a crew of 10, can carry up to 13 machine guns, 4-engine bomber, can go up to 325, but it cruises around 120, 150, ballpark figure to maintain formation. It's got about a 3,000 mile range, and it can go about 600 miles. Okay? It's called a flying fortress because it's a porcupine with all these guns on it. It can defend itself. I don't need fighter escort. Why? Because the bomber will always get through. Go back to some of my earlier tenets regarding American precision bombing. The bomber will always get through, and with all these crewmen on here with machine guns, they're going to be able to protect this aircraft. And so we're going to conduct the combined bomber offensive largely through the use of the B-17. It's a beautiful airplane. You still see some of them flying around today, and if you pay enough money, you can get a ride on one. So I highly recommend it. It's tax deductible. Just throw that out there for you. Okay. Operation Point Blank is the name given to the combined bomber offensive of the Army Air Corps as they're going against the German infrastructure and economy itself. Again, what we're aiming at is enemy morale, but not by killing people, but by killing the sinews of war and their ability to prosecute this thing. And it's interesting when you look at this application, you have to think about, what are you bombing? Why are you bombing it? What do you hope to achieve with this effect? And what the Army Air Corps looks at is, in a modern mechanized industrial society, it's like a web. Power to factories, water to people, creates housing. Everything is interconnected in a web. And that's kind of how they're going to start this campaign, is trying to hit these various locations in this social web that modern economies are. Okay? But something happens on the way to the form in terms of this combined bomber offensive. Now remember, I told you, hey, these bombers can always get through. I got 13 guns. I can defend myself, so it shouldn't be a problem. The bomber will always get through. In the words of Lee Corso, not so fast, my friends. A few college football fans out there, okay? What they find out is, when they're getting over Germany, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is decimating these bomber formations. The early fighters have a very limited range. If they're flying out of southern England here, and you can see some of the fighter ranges. The earlier fighters, the P-47s, which is the first fighter they're going to start using, has an escort range of about to here to Bremen, around to Frankfurt, just around Paris. Now the Luftwaffe is not dumb. What they'll do is they'll say the fighter escort coming in, and they'll just wait. Oh, they're out of fuel now. Fight's on. Okay? And so during this period of time that we're talking about here in 1942 and early in 1943, you don't have a lot of fighter escort once these guys are getting deep into Germany. And that's what we're talking about here with regard to Memphis Belle. It's that period of time where there's no fighter escort once you start getting into Germany itself. Now later in January around 1944, when you start producing P-51s with drop tanks, you can go all the way to Vienna and see the von Trapp family singers if you're interested, okay, and then come on back. But it takes a while to get there. So the later part of 1942 and through all of 1943, it's going to be a row. And I'll give you some numbers. I'm a historian, but I got to give you numbers, okay? Crews are required to fly 25 missions. They have to give these guys something, a target to hit in terms of rotation, because these are highly trained airmen, and you have to give them something to hang their hat on, something to look forward to in order to end their combat tours. Okay? So if you fly 25 missions, you get to go home. Well, the problem is, and you can see here, in 1943, your chances of completing 25 missions is about 1 in 5. Okay? Now, I'm no mathematician, okay? But you're losing about 8, 9, 10% of your bomber force on each raid, okay? Now do the math. If I'm losing, say, 10% of my bombing raids force on each raid, and I got to fly 25 missions, statistically speaking, when is my number up? Yeah, around 10, 11, right around there. Statistically, these guys aren't going to get to 25. And as you can see here, many of them don't. The losses are horrendous. And when you look at the Army Air Corps' disposition, not a paid political advertisement, but the guys who are generally smarter and more capable and mechanically inclined are in the Air Corps. Okay? And so this is really the flower of American manhood that is going down in flames quite literally in this endeavor. Let me give you another statistic here, and I'm going to have to turn to my Marine card, but this is an important statistic. For the entire war, the 8th Air Force alone, the 8th Air Force flying out of England alone will lose 26,000 men killed in action. There's another 50,000 who are wounded, okay? But I'm talking about KIA, guys who don't come home. 8th Air Force alone. For the United States Marine Corps, the Marine Corps in the Pacific, all of us, 19,000. The Army Air Corps and the 8th Air Force will lose more airmen than the Marine Corps loses Marines, to give you an idea of how scale and scope here. Okay? And these are young men. Most of your B-17 crewmen, average age, 21, 20, ballpark figure. The officers may be a little bit older, but your enlisted air crewmen, 19, maybe some college, maybe. If the guy's got some college, he's probably an officer. Many of them maybe high school graduates. A lot of these guys fresh off of the farm. But this picture to me is chilling because you look at these men are in the prime of their life. You know, they're just setting out in the world. And this picture of, and keep in mind, one B-17 has 10, 11, 12 crewmen on it. There's a whole squad that will go down if a plane goes down. And I think the movie captures this part of the air war very well. So let's roll the clip.
Sir, I think you better come take a look.
You know, we gotta liven up that whole area. And make sure the banner is centered, right? What's the meaning of this? Then put the piano up on the platform. It's just a little party, Colonel. I did not order this. I didn't order this. Leave this stuff to me. The Memphis Belle is my job. And my job is to approve everything on this base. I did not authorize a homecoming. Craig, you're working a little hard at being a hard ass. What's the harm in a little party in honor of these guys? They're special. I have 24 crews up there. They are all special to me. Well, that's a great story, but baloney's my business. I know it when I see it. All you care about is getting planes in the air. Results. Round-nosing HQ. The only man in the whole...
Come with me.
You don't care if these men live or die. It's just another airplane. If it was up to you... Sit down. Start reading.
This one's from a father whose son had his head blown off over Lorient. Start with that.
Hey, I think you're cracking up.
Read it!
Dear Colonel Harriman, I want to thank you for your letter about my son, Tommy. He was only at your base a month, but he must have made a big impression because you described him right down to his boots. I wish you could have told me how Tommy died, but I guess we have to be careful about security and all. I'm glad he was brave and did his job to the end. Maybe his mother and I raised him right after all. I guess we'll get used to him being gone, but not too soon, I hope. Well, I can always read your letter, and that will bring him back.
Dear sir, your letter of December 10th finally made me realize that my husband is gone. I have been living in the false hopes that the telegram I received was a mistake.
Dear sir,
Larry,
I am writing on behalf of my parents, who appreciated your letter to them about my brother's death. We were all glad to know that Frank didn't suffer and was not alone when he died.
I saw him off at the train station when he left to go overseas, and he was happy and excited to be doing something important with his life. He couldn't stop looking at the stripes on his shoulder.
I hope when this is all over that the world will have learned that there's a better way to solve its problems. My prayers are for my husband's comrades. May they fly safely and return home to their loved ones soon. Best wishes, Mrs. Peter Little.
I think that film clip captures, you know, the essence of what's going on early here in 1943. This picture shows you what the Flack was like, the anti-aircraft artillery that the Germans would throw up against a bomber formation. And the crews used to joke that it was so thick that you could walk on it. And you can see here you have a whole formation of B-17s have to fly through what's called a flak box. The Germans knew where the approaches were, where the bombers were coming from, and they would throw up as much flak into a sector of the sky that the planes would have to fly through. And then they would often have a flak box on the far end of the city because, you know, the planes had to go over the target, drop their bombs, and they would still be in formation. So it wasn't just air-to-air combat, it was also the flak. Let me go back just another second here to talk about the pre-war analysis. And I touched on it a little bit, but I want to expand it a little bit more. The young men who are flying these planes, like I said, most of them maybe some college, 20, 21 years old. But for your average mission, flying with the 8th Air Force, you're in an unpressurized aircraft at 20,000 feet. So the temperature is probably negative 20, negative 30, given, you know, the temperatures in Europe. There's the side guns, there's no windows. So the guys are literally moving the machine guns in the slipstream, fighting the wind. You're on oxygen all the time because you're at 20,000 feet. And the oxygen systems at this time are not very good. They often froze up. And anybody here who's an aviator, see a guy wearing his flight jacket right here, knows that anoxia, which is a lack of oxygen, you just basically fall asleep. And a lot of men who die of anoxia don't even know what happens because they just kind of fall asleep. One of the requirements of the co-pilot is to do oxygen checks every 10 minutes to make sure everybody's awake. Okay? So you're on oxygen, you're at 20,000 feet, it's really cold, so you have to wear underalls that are basically plugged into the aircraft itself that provide heat throughout your body. And you're doing this for anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. We complain if we don't get peanuts when we're flying in our 737 at 30,000 feet. Okay? These guys are doing it for 6 to 8 hours. And on top of it, it's life or death. There's no foxhole they can go climb in. They're in a thin aluminum tube, and the Germans are throwing 88 millimeters at you, 20 millimeters out of their guns. And so when a round hits an aircraft made out of aluminum, it causes significant damage. And just like in that letter, or in that clip, the guy says, he lost his head over Lorient. Yes, it's that gruesome. The only positive these guys have over their ground counterparts is if they get wounded, it's so cold it might coagulate the blood a little fast because it'll freeze and you won't bleed out. So maybe we can slap a bandage on it. No, by the way, it's still another 4 or 5 hours until we get home. So again, their war is very different from their ground counterparts. And in some ways, it's a little bit harsher in terms of the environment. Not only fighting the Germans, they're fighting the environment. That's what's different about it. The original crew. These are the real heroes we're talking about, not the guys that you see in the movie. Their first mission was in November 7th, 1942, and they're going to go hit the submarine pens in Brest, France. The Germans had established U-boat bases there on the western coast of France so they could go interdict the convoys that we were sending from the United States to Great Britain. And that's their first target, and they miss it, don't even hit the city. So they get credit for the target, or the mission, but they didn't hit the target. And the combined bomber offensive is replete with these kinds of stories. Again, I can hit the target over the clear skies of southern Texas, but put me in combat at 20,000 feet and all those other factors I talked about, gets a little bit more complicated than that. And not to mention, I'm sure these guys are just plain scared. I know I would be. And so throw this human dynamic into this warfare. Okay? And so it doesn't necessarily pan out the way they really thought it was going to be. We had this picture of the original Memphis Belle crew. However, this is one of the little side notes. Anybody who's worked with a fleet of trucks or aircraft or whatever it is, you know, not every aircraft and plane is made the same. Some work better than others. Some go down for maintenance more often. You got to recycle things too based upon the schedule, preventive maintenance, corrective maintenance. So I don't want you to think that these guys flying Memphis Belle flew Memphis Belle 25 times as a contiguous crew and then came back after the 25th mission. No. There was plenty of footnotes here because crewmen got sick, guys had to go fill other seats, they had to stand down because they had flown the day before, so somebody else flew their plane. So there's a real shell game here with regard to what do you mean by the first to fly 25? And oh, by the way, the airplane's its own entity. The plane will reach 25 missions on a different date than the crew flies 25 missions. And oh, by the way, not all those guys, like I told you, flew as a contiguous crew. So some guys' dates for 25 missions were different from other guys' dates from 25 missions. So dissuade yourself of, this is the one plane they flew it all the time, and nobody else flew it. There are plenty of stories where some guy's aircraft never came back because somebody on the crew was flying it. Happens a lot. Anybody who's done fleet management understands that. And so this is the original crew of the Belle itself. And again, she's part of the 322nd Bomb Squad, 91st Bomb Group. Again, they didn't fly all their missions in Memphis Belle. You can see here the crew finished their missions around 17 May, but the Belle finished it on 19 May. See, there's that discrepancy that I was talking about. Over 50 different airmen flew the Belle during her combat tour, and she had 3 different top gunners, 3 waist gunners, and several different co-pilots. Again, they're not contiguous crews. You try to, so you understand how each man works and how they their temperament and how well they do their jobs. But again, maybe somebody's got a head cold that day. Okay, grab me somebody else to fit in as top gunner that day. And so it's not this contiguous, same crew, same pilot all the time. It changes up. And there were other planes that were close to 25. Hell's Angels, Delta Rebel, Jersey Browns, Connecticut Yankee, and they were all vying for this first to do 25. Here's the truth. Memphis Belle's not the first. Hell's Angels was the first B-17 to do, the aircraft to do 25. The aircraft to do 25. Crew's different. Plus, Hell's Angels is not a real public name you want to throw out there for the Army Air Corps in the Second World War. But there's more to this story. The guy who makes the movie, a guy named Bill Wyler, we'll talk about him in a little bit. He leaps onto Memphis Belle because he walks the squadron line, and he likes the nose art. And then he finds out that this crew is getting close to 25, and he's going to make a movie for the war effort. And he meets with the pilot, Captain Morgan, and they strike up a conversation, and they like each other. They have a general rapport. Well, after the Belle flies its 25th mission, and the crew fly their 25th mission, Morgan asked Bill Wyler, well, what happened if the Belle didn't come back on its 25th mission? Or we didn't come back on its 25th mission? What were you going to do then? And Wyler says, no problem. I had plenty of footage of Hell's Angels. So again, dissuade yourself of it's just this one plane, and that's all there was to it. Okay? Now let's talk a little bit about Bill Wyler here. He's making this is the first Memphis Belle movie, the original. And you can download it on YouTube if you're interested. And here is Bill right here in the center. Again, we're trying to gin up war bonds and trying to get general support behind this war effort. And Hap Arnold, like I said before, his guiding star is getting as much publicity for the Army Air Corps as possible. As a matter of fact, I found a letter that he writes to Ira Aker in 1943, and he writes in it, he says, we're getting the impression here in the United States that the RAF, the Royal Air Force, is really taking it to the Germans, and we, the U.S. Army Air Corps, are only hitting it with pinpricks. Can't we someday in the near future lay a whole block flat? So much for the precision stuff, right? Okay, moving on. Wyler actually flies combat missions in the Second World War, and he doesn't reserve them to what's called a milk run. A milk run is a really easy mission. Instead of flying over Bremen or Berlin or Ludwigshafen, a milk run is considering going and hitting a French fuel farm or maybe the subboat pens because they're not really well defended, not like Germany is well defended. But Wyler does not reserve himself for flying milk runs. He actually flies combat missions into Germany itself in order to get the feel of combat. And at one time, as I mentioned to you about the oxygen system, his oxygen system freezes up and he passes out on a combat mission. And one of the crewmen notices it and gives him supplemental oxygen so he's okay. But again, it kind of speaks to the danger not only that Bill was in, but also the crews themselves. But he actually flew these missions to kind of understand what was going on with regard to the combined bomber offensive. Which takes us to the modern day movie itself. Made in 1990, directed by Michael Catton, who did Doc Hollywood, and Rob Roy. Memphis Belle is a fictionalized account of it. I think you already understood where I'm going with this in terms of fictionalization of it. Interestingly enough, the co-producer was the daughter of Bill Wyler, kind of a family connection there. Obviously, there aren't a lot of B-17s flying around anymore. And so what they did, they took 5 B-17s and they had a few P-51s and they kind of cobbled them together to give the representation of a large air fleet. And there aren't any flying, there's only maybe 1 or 2 flying ME-109s around anymore. There's not a lot of them. What they did was the Spanish took ME-109s from the Second World War and slapped on a Merlin engine, and it's called the Hispania 1112. And if anybody watched the movie The Battle of Britain back in 1969, I was 4, by the way, but anyway, 1969, that's what they're flying, Hispania 1112s, because there aren't a lot of 109s flying around anymore. And that's what they use. All the aviation purists get upset. Those aren't 109s. They're doing what they can with what they got, so give the guys a break, okay? One B-17 is actually lost during the filming of the movie. The plane's going down the runway at about 500 feet. One of the engine loses power. The pilot tries to compensate. He overcompensates. The plane fishtails. The left wing hits a tree, and it crashes in a field. Everybody gets out. There are some people that are injured, but at least everybody got out. But they lost an entire B-17 in the filming of the movie. So how do you make a few B-17s look like a whole fleet of B-17s? Well, one of the things that they did was they built a lot of wooden mock-ups in silhouettes that they would park in the background to look like you had a whole fleet of B-17s sitting out there. The other thing they did, and going back to my nose art comment, they changed the nose art on some of the functioning B-17s. So one day it was Vacillating Virgin, the next day it's Mother and Country, you know, and so they give this perception that they had more airframes than they really had. And even today, there's even less B-17s. We lost one, 2 years ago. One crashed, I think, by Chicago. So, you know, I can't remember. And then one crashed in the field, too. There's two less than what we had a few years ago. So it's very hard to kind of do this. And they filmed it there in Great Britain, and part of the operational scenes where planes were actually flying, they filmed at a place called Duxford, which today, if you go to England, and it's where the Imperial War Museum has its airplane collection, you are missing out if you're an airplane fan and you haven't been to Duxford. It is like the holy grail for aviation geeks like myself, so good thing my wife wasn't there. All right. Let me show you a clip of how well they did this. Oh, here's the movie production. Here's a 109. Here's a Hispania 1112. The big difference is here in the nose. See, there's a big scoop. In a 109, there's no big scoop up here. That's how you can tell the difference between the two. Okay? Here's the mock-up. Here's the back of a B-17. You can see it's just wood. And, of course, they use some models, too, for some of the flying scenes to create the damage. All right. Keep in mind, these men know their chances, and they climb into these planes every day. Not to mention, each one of these planes is probably carrying a couple tons worth of high explosive bombs, a full bag of gas, ammunition. And so if you crash on takeoff, you're probably going to have a fire and you're not going to make it out. That's assuming all your engines are working, you have the horsepower you need to get off the ground. You see the mock-ups in the background? That's colorized war film right there. And it's nice that these planes aren't all pristine. They're dirty, they're scratched. This is what combat aircraft look like. Oil streaks, exhaust stains. During takeoff, the crew would all generally sit in the radio compartment, or the bombardier and the navigator would sit in the front compartment. That plane got off the ground, but those of you who've been to England know that it's not much better than Germany in terms of overcast or undercast, depending how you want to look at it. And keep in mind that southern England is a relatively small place. England's about the size of Oregon, ballpark figure. And you have hundreds of B-17s flying in formation over the skies over southern England. Once they get airborne, a lot of times they had to fly through an overcast to join up with the formation. And they're doing this blind. Lots of air-to-air collisions. So even though you took off with your full bag of gas, your couple thousand pounds worth of bombs and all your ammunition, there were lots of collisions as guys came up through the undercast and ran into another B-17. This is before radar and positive controlled airspace and those things that modern aviators know about. So the danger wasn't on takeoff, it was also forming up as well. All right, the cast. Most of these names you've probably seen before. Matthew Modine, D.B. Sweeney, Billy Zane of Titanic fame, Eric Stoltz of Mask fame. Now I'm dating myself with Mask, okay? Sean Austin, if you're a big Rudy fan, is in there as well. And Harry Connick, of course, sings some tunes. And we have John Lithgow, who you saw as the public affairs officer, and David Stratharn is playing the role of Colonel Harriman, who's the group commander. So it really is a pretty good star-studded cast in terms of people who will be stars. Again, this is 1990, and some of them who already were stars. The movie kind of fell short of the critical mark. Here's what Roger Ebert, when he was still alive, says about it, and then Andy Webb. And I don't think they're far off the mark. There's a lot of colloquialism that are used during this time. They don't develop the characters as much, and quite frankly, they're completely off on their characters. Okay? None of those men were like that. None of them were like that. But again, it makes for a more interesting movie to make him colorful characters and to put some more drama in, like the D.B. Sweeney character not wanting to fly and trying to make himself sick and all those kinds of things like that. That doesn't happen with the real crew of Memphis Belle. There wasn't any of that kind of drama going on. But again, it makes for a better movie, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. And it has a Rotten Tomato score of 64%. So whatever you put in Rotten Tomatoes, that's what it says. Okay? So let's go through the reality of this. We talked about, like most movies, most of the facts are misrepresented. Talked about first to fly 25. Yeah, kinda. Kinda. It depends on how you want to roll the numbers on this. Talked about attempts to capture the context of the air war, the dangers that are involved and what these men faced on a regular basis. This particular mission that they're flying never happened, okay? But what it does do, it's largely an amalgamation. Those kinds of things did happen, okay? There were guys who didn't want to fly, who had to deal with the struggle of life and death. The Air Force is really kind of sketchy on the Army Air Corps, I should say, not the Air Force. The Army Air Corps is kind of sketchy on the numbers. I tried to find what the percentage was of guys who refused to fly, and it's really hard to find that number. They didn't keep really good records, or they suppressed them. One of the two, I don't know which is true, but you don't really know. There were some, of course, and in the accounts that I have read from other crewmen who did their full complement, these men who couldn't do it anymore, they weren't thought less of by their fellow crewmen. They understood the pressure that they were on, and they were just stronger than those guys were, and they knew it could be me, So there wasn't that necessarily stigma, but they got these guys out right away. One of the things they did for the crews was they would send what's called Flack farms. And what they were was a nice estate somewhere in the English countryside for 2 weeks to kind of just decompress and kind of relax a little bit, and then hopefully come back and put them back in the cockpit. One of the most visual signs of what's going on here, and they talk a little bit about it in the movie in the beginning when one of the crewmen don't come back, is these guys are living in Quonset huts or squad bays if you're in the Army. And as guys passed away or didn't come back, you'd see these empty cots. And if a whole B-17 went down, there's 13 empty cots. But these guys are living with these individuals, and so they had to live with this visual of they didn't come back. And again, these are your smarter bears in the Army Air Corps at this time, just the demographic. And these are guys who are generally literate, could think abstractly, and could really get in touch with what was going on. And so it kind of adds to some of the stress that these individuals were over. But again, if you saw in the movie too, I didn't show the clip, but there's one scene where Billy Zane goes in the back of it, he shoots the MA-109 down, it slashes through the fuselage of an American bomber, and the crew goes down. Yes, those kind of things happened. Planes collided. There was even one instance where a B-17 got hit, it flew out of control, and it actually, when inverted, hit another B-17 next to it, and they were stuck together. And then both planes went down. A lot of these crews, if they weren't killed outright by an attack of an enemy fighter, as a plane, a B-17 has a 103-foot wingspan. It's a big wingspan for the time. Obviously, modern jets are much bigger, but at the time it was 103 feet. And I showed you the clip, you saw one of them in a spin. Sometimes these planes would get hit, go into a spin, the crew would be perfectly fine, but the centrifugal force would pin them in the aircraft as it was going down, and they couldn't get out. So again, what you're seeing here in the movie is an amalgamation of a lot of the things that occurred by bomber crews in the 8th Air Force, but they just put them all into one mission, okay? So dispel yourself with the fact that they had to crank the landing gear down to make sure they landed on that last mission. No, they didn't have that problem, but there were plenty of missions where they had to. On a side note here, you notice on the bottom of B-17 there's a ball turret. Short little guy would sit in this thing, squat, with the receivers of the 50 cals up by his head, and he would be able to move this, 360 degrees, basically. Sometimes landing gear didn't come down and the hydraulics got shot out. What are you going to do? Yes, it happened. The Belle's last mission was relatively uneventful. Okay, she flew over France, it wasn't even Bremen, did her mission, and then came back. When the crew flew its last mission, remember the Belle flies its 25th, a couple days later, the crew flies there. When the crew, the general crew, because again, some guys got sent out, once they hit the White Cliffs of Dover, they went nuts. The guys started throwing stuff out the windows. When they got back to home base, they got a clearance to buzz the tower, if you watch Top Gun. And Robert Morgan says, I clipped the grass better than a lawn boy. And he flew solo. Okay. And so there was a celebration of the crew when they came back. It was not what you saw where they're getting the young radio operator out and they're tending to them and all those. No, that's not how it happened. Relatively benign environment, relatively. And they made it back in fine fashion on their last mission. Okay? And once they land back, they lift up Robert Morgan and he kisses the Belle side of the fuselage, to kind of say thank you. So again, what you're seeing here is not really historical, but it's an amalgamation of a lot of historical events that did, in fact, happen to various air crews during the Second World War. What happens after? Well, guess what? Margaret Polk doesn't marry Robert Morgan. He goes, after the Belle gets famous, they go on a PR tour, and the relationship doesn't endure. He's being wined and dined from one coast to the other, and he meets up with a lady called Margaret Polk. Okay? And as a result, he starts training on B-29s here in Kansas, quite frankly, at Pratt Army Airfield. Some of you might know where that is. That's where he learns how to fly the B-29, and he goes to the Pacific, and he names his new plane Dauntless Dottie. So the original Belle doesn't survive, at least the relationship at any rate. She survives the war, of course, but doesn't survive the relationship. And he actually takes part in the bombing campaign over Tokyo in 1944 and 1945. What happens to the Belle? Well, if you're lucky enough to go to the Army or the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, they just finished refurbishing her 2 or 3 years ago. Somebody can correct me on when they did it. She sat outside in Memphis for years, and anybody who knows airplanes sitting outside for a long period of time is bad for airplanes. They don't like it. Made out of aluminum, people jump on them, and they rust, and all those kinds of things. So they put her in an enclosed environment for a while. Yeah, that kind of helped, but then the Air Force said, no, we want her back. And it took them like 4 or 5 years. They took the Belle all the way down to her bits and pieces and reconstructed her. And I was actually there when she was in her bits and pieces. And I actually watched some of the craftsmen rebuild components. So they really did a painstakingly accurate job of what she looked like at the time. And you could see where people had carved their name into her skin and those, and vandals, smashing components and stuff like that, as vandals do. But nowadays she is resplendent in the U.S. Air Force Museum. I have not seen her since she has been put out for display, but you can see they have her up on stands. You can kind of look underneath her as well to kind of see the Belle in her entirety. But that's where she sits today. So that's a good news story. Yes, that is me as a young captain with Robert Morgan before his untimely demise. So with that, I will open the floor to questions.
John, thank you very much. Once again, we've got 2 microphones at the end of each of these aisles here, or actually at the front of each of these aisles, if anybody's got any questions. I've one to start, and I apologize if you covered this and I missed it. How many of any of the crewmen who might have flown the Memphis Belle are still alive? Do you know?
I don't think any of them are alive. I think, by this time they're in their 90s.
Right, I know.
I mean, they survived the war, but what happens to the individuals afterwards, I can't speak to that. I'm sure there probably are some records that are kept. I'm not aware of the individual crewmen's lives after the fact. I couldn't tell you, except for Colonel Morgan.
Question right here.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. On the topic of the precision bombing, do you have a view on whether the bombing methods toward the end of the war in particular, like perhaps Dresden or even in the Pacific Theater, firebombing of Tokyo, whether those bombing tactics would survive any kind of modern law of war analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fortunately for you, sir, that's what I wrote my dissertation on. So, you got a couple hours? No, I'm just kidding. I won't do that to you. It is my contention that what happens is we frame this idea of precision bombardment, And as I mentioned to you in the pitch, as time goes on, this is harder than we thought for many of the reasons that I told you. And as a result, because we need to show some results, because this war is dragging on, because we want to get it over with, target sets expand. And this idea of precision. Let me give you another point to this. Go back to the individual piece on this. You're a young 21-year-old navigator. Okay? You only get credit if you fly a combat mission. If you don't drop your bombs on a target, you ain't getting credit for that mission. So what are you going to do? I'm dropping those bombs. Okay? There was an unwritten rule that if your primary target was fogged over, you had a secondary. Okay? If the secondary was fogged over, find the nearest town and bomb it on your own. And near the end of the war, a lot of the crews would come back and say, well, I couldn't find their primary, couldn't find the secondary, we bombed a rail yard. Rail yards are big. Would it stand the scrutiny today? No, it would not. However, there is a debate going on in the highest levels of the U.S. Army Air Corps and the War Department over this, what you call massacre by bombing, which is some of the peace activists. Vera Brittain is one who says, this is what we're doing. There's a debate that goes on. There's a small minority of people that do this. And Secretary of War Henry Stimson writes to Hap Arnold, and he says, are we going to outdo the Nazis in terms of atrocities? And Arnold writes back, because I've seen the letter, and he says, this is a shooting war, and now is not the time to get soft. So the American people become hardened to it, if you get where I'm going with this. And we start going to the firebombing of Tokyo. For the American people, your brother, your uncle, your cousin is where? Somewhere on a troop ship who's got to go invade Japan, potentially in November 1st, 1945. Do you really care if we kill a bunch of, and I'm using the vernacular term, Japs, who are not humans anyway in 1945 in our view of the time? Do you care? And most people don't. Yes, there are some who decry it, but most people by this time, by 44 and 45, it's not a major issue.
I'm a recovering Army lawyer, and if you want us to get a bunch of Army lawyers together and get them to start arguing,
yeah,
give them this topic.
Oh, absolutely. And this is a great topic with my students. Hey, is this, you got to get the job done, and so you start getting into what is a valuable target, what is a legal target, and you're right, it's very messy. It's very difficult. Thank you for the question, sir.
John, question to your right?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. This is, in your opinion, what is the worst position to be in on a B-17
Yeah,
crew?
that's a great question. Actually,
Mine is navigator.
well, that is the worst place to be, is the navigator or the bombardier. Why? Because the Germans realize that the weakest part of a B-17 is its front. Okay? And so because you have all these other guns in the back and around it, so what happens is the Luftwaffe starts coming at the bombers from the front to shoot not only the bomber, but also who's in the front too? The pilot. There's two pilots in a B-17, but you take those two guys out. Now, there actually are instances where both pilots are incapacitated and an air crewman takes over. There's a couple of Medal of Honors that have come out that way, but that is the worst place to be, is in the front. The later versions of the B-17, the G version, they'll put two 50 cals in the bottom of the nose, the plexiglass, to kind of beef it up. But I'm behind a plexiglass screen, and he's coming at me in an ME-109 at 300 knots behind a big engine block shooting 20 millimeters at me. I'd rather be behind the engine. I'm just saying, if it was me, that's the place you don't want to be.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
John, looks like we've got 4 more questions here, so we'll
and if I
cut
don't
it
get them
off
all, I'll
after
stay
these
afterwards.
4. That's
fine,
great.
too. Yes, sir.
I have a 3-part question. What was the normal rank of the pilots?
Yeah, most of them are first lieutenants, captains, for the most part. Every now and then, your senior officer, a major or lieutenant colonel, a squadron commander, or the group commander. They also flew missions, but largely first lieutenants, second lieutenants, lower-ranking officers.
And how much training, how many hours of training did they get?
Yeah, another great question. This is something that changes as the war progresses. As we get stronger and produce more pilots and have more guys in the pipeline, the number of hours starts to go up, like 200, 300 hours before you even get to theater. Okay? If you think about it, it takes at least 100 hours to fly the stinking airplane. Take off, land, turn, all those basic things that pilots do. That takes about 100 hours, especially with 4-engine aircraft and stuff like that. So they fly about 200, 300 hours before they get to theater. And then when they get to theater, they still have to go under some local combat training to find out how the group flies and standard operating procedures and those kinds of things.
And what type of fuel did they use in those airplanes?
100 low lead. Yeah.
Okay, and
Aromatic fuel. That's what they called it. I don't know what they mean. Somebody probably knows what aromatic is. I don't.
was that the airplane that Joe Kennedy or?
Joe Kennedy. Oh, yeah, or I forget his name. Yeah, that was an old B-17 that they had modified for a project called Aphrodite. And what they did was, it was a remote control B-17. They packed it full of explosives. This is the truth. I'm not making this up. You can go check me on interwebs. They took this B-17, packed it full of explosives. They had a pilot take off with it, fly it in a direction towards a German target, okay? And then once the radio turned on, you know, and they could fly the plane, the pilot was supposed to jump out with a parachute, and they would recover him. True story, go look it up. Well, he takes off, and before he gets a chance to jump out, plane blows up. So yes, Project Aphrodite is what it's called. So it's a true story. Yes, sir?
You said the survival rate in 43 and the 17s was like 20%. When 8th Air Force and 15th converted over to 24s and 44, did that survival rate change?
Later on, the war gets better. Why? Because Luftwaffe is getting shredded. So the 25 mission requirement goes to 30.
My dad
goes
was
to
30.
35. You know, and those of you who've seen Catch-22, Yossarian, hey, you told me 25, now it's 30, you know. So to your point, they start to raise it as the Luftwaffe gets decimated and more planes are coming in and those kinds of things. So yeah, did that happen? You said your father had that experience?
Yeah, he had 30.
Yeah, my godfather flew 52. He did 2 tours in B-17s before he went over the train for 29s. But yeah, they changed the numbers. And a lot of guys, you can see, I'm on 25. Ah, crap, it's 30 now, you know. It did happen. It did
I didn't
happen.
know if the 24s had a difference in 17s.
Yeah,
for
boy, that's
survival,
a good,
or
yeah, I have to look. I think, here's the deal with 24s. They could carry more,
Right.
They could fly farther and fly faster. The problem is they're not as stable as a gun platform, and their wing, the Davis wing that it used, was more susceptible to damage than what the B-17 had. And you can see all kinds of films where the B-24 wing just crumples, like paper, it crumples, where the B-17 could take a hit. You can see pictures where the entire side of the fuselage is ripped off and the darn thing lands. My godfather's squadron is the one where you see the 109 flew through the fuselage and the tail is barely hanging on. That's his squadron. The plane flew through the B-17, almost cut it in half, and it still landed. Brought the crew back. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
My question is, in the movie, there was a lot of chatter between aircraft on the mission.
Yeah.
Did that
No,
occur
they
or did not occur?
generally kept radio silence because the Germans, at this time, with automatic direction finding equipment, electronic emissions, and those kinds of things, and the Germans have radar. They try to keep that to a minimum. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of, hey, Bill, what are you doing? Let's get some girls tonight. There's not a lot of that. And as the war progresses, you start actually seeing the genesis of electronic warfare, as we would know it today. They would take, early on in the war, I'm not kidding, strips of tinfoil and drop it out the window because the German radars, you know, these are early radars, they couldn't discriminate between an actual metal airplane and a piece of tin that was flying out. They called it window. That's what they did. So you see guys just throwing this stuff out the windows, these metal, you know, strips. So you didn't see a lot of that going on. Radio discipline, like most military professionals, keeping that to a minimum. Now, within the aircraft, that's different. That's in the ICS, the intercom system. That's different because it's not transmitting out. Inside, that's a whole different matter. So yeah, they're talking and they're doing radio checks and things like that, but transmitting out, no. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I noticed a picture very early in your presentation of a man in that nose cone.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the navigator or the bombardier?
Okay, in the nose of a B-17, there are 2 men. One is the bombardier, one is the navigator. The bombardier sits in the very front. The navigator sits just to his rear. He has a little table there where he keeps his map and his air computer, stuff like that. And the bombardier has a front row seat sitting right there to drop his bombs. So there's 2 men that actually sit up there.
My father was a navigator.
Okay.
B-17, 8th Army Air Corps.
Okay.
He said that he had to take control of the plane sometimes during a bombing run.
What happened, when you hit what's called the initial point, the IP, usually what happens is a pilot would flip control of the aircraft over to the bombardier, and the Norden bomb sight, this is like your first kind of airborne computers, I'll use that term, and it's not the right term to use, but we'll use that term, would actually fly the airplane on the bomb run.
Well, then he must have been a bombardier as well.
Okay, because that's what happens. The pilot, and you see it in the movie where he flips. It's actually the autopilot in the movie. For those of you who know what the B-17 cockpit looks like, that's not what it looked like. But at any rate, he flips it over, and it's called the thing called the PDI. What it does is it follows a track that the bomb site's telling it to fly. And then what the navigator's doing, he's watching the reticle, and he's waiting for, if you look at the site, there's a running tab, and when these two lines cross, that's your release point. And it's all based upon geometry and things I don't understand. But
Thank you.
Rate. Yes, ma'am. Basic geometry, too. Okay, so I put that out there.
Great program, John.
Thank you.
My question is, you said that 26,000 airmen lost their lives.
In the 8th Air Force.
In the 8th Air Force. Obviously, the 15th Air Force.
A little bit less.
A little less. Okay. How many young men actually signed up for the U.S. Army Air Corps?
Oh, boy, you got me on that one.
I'm wondering what the percentage is. What I'm thinking is, as far as the recruitment, a young man shows up, it's World War II, he has patriotism, I want to fight for my country. Do I become a Marine? Do I go in the Army? Or do I go in the Air Corps? I think they probably hid the problem with what the survival rate was in the U.S. Army
Well,
Air
I'm sure
Corps.
they weren't advertising. But one of the things that they did, just like in modern, they had the what we called it, the written test you take to get into the military, aptitude test, thank you. They had it, there was a name for it, I forget what it is right now, but they had an aptitude test they made them take, and the smarter bears, Army Air Corps. And this is where you get the term for, for the infantry, and the goddamn infantry, it's all the leftovers, all the stupid people. And that was it was a running joke. I'm not besmirching any infantrymen, they got my respect. But really the Air Corps is where the guys who had some G2, had some ability, math, science, mechanical abilities, go into the Air Corps. They're the smarter guys. I'm sure they weren't advertising the rates of loss. I have no doubt that they were doing that. But you did find generally the more educated guys, again, guys who are illiterate and those kinds of things, had skills, go to the Army Air Corps. And a lot of the enlisted crewmen in the Army Air Corps, like the gunners, the flight engineers and stuff like that, a lot of them were washouts from flight school. The guys couldn't, handle flying an airplane. Okay, the guy's got some skill. Put him in gunner school, and now he's, manning a 50 cal instead of flying the airplane. And I talked about some of those missions where a guy flies a plane back. Yeah, there's a couple of those where the guy had some stick time, got washed out, but he flew the plane back and landed, or got it back to England and those kinds of things. So I know exactly where you can go find that number. Go look up Craven and Kate, Volume 7 of the Army Air Corps in the Second World War, and it will tell you more numbers than you could possibly shake a stick at. So it is available, and it's online too.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, sir.
John, thank you so much. Thank all of you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
John, you were terrific.
Thank you so much.